Thank you all so much for coming. It's a wonderful pleasure on behalf of myself, Stephanie Frampton, and my co-convener, Eric Goldberg, to invite all of you to the final meeting of MIT's Ancient and Medieval Studies Colloquium for spring 2022. I have the pleasure today of introducing a friend and colleague, Hannah Čulík Baird, who's Assistant Professor of Classical Studies at Boston University. Hannah has written compellingly on a range of topics in the space of Roman literary studies, including on Stoicism and the stars, slavery and immigration, and poetry and comedy. Her interests and expertise in particular lie into really intertwined threads of Latin literary culture. On the one hand, Cicero and Roman intellectual life, and on the other, fragments and fragmentation. Hannah is also at the forefront of thinking about questions of equity, access, race, and social justice in the history and future of ancient Greek and Roman studies. She's co-organizer of Race Difficiles, an annual online conference addressing inequality in the field of classics, which will be meeting May 20th this year. And Hannah, perhaps you can drop a link to that in the chat as well. And she's perhaps known to many of you here also for being a leading voice on classics Twitter, where she posts as O Pietas Animi. Hannah is someone whose work I'm always delighted to read, and I've had the enormous pleasure of getting a preview of the book about which she'll be talking with us today. That is Cicero and the Early Latin Poets, which appears with Cambridge University Press tomorrow. So it's a book with a deceptively simple title, I think, after which we'll neither read Cicero nor poetic fragments in quite the same way again. So without further ado, and with many thanks to Jessica Tranvo for organizing and to all of you for joining us, I'll happily turn things over to Hannah and say we'll hold the questions to the end when we'll take them both in chat and viva voce. Okay, thanks so much.
Okay, great. I'm going to just now share my screen. This is a trick that I just learned from Twitter, how to put your video in the screen. How does this look? Does it look good for everyone? Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Okay, before I begin, let me say thank you to Stephanie and Eric for having me, and to Jessica for arranging everything, and to the MIT AMS Colloquium. You know, it's been such a pleasure and delight to be Stephanie's neighbor across the river here in Boston, and I'm really, this is such a great timing for me to give this paper when my book is about to come out. And also, it's very moving to me. There's so many people in the room right now that are, you know, from my life all over. I'm like tearing up, actually. Like lots of people who really mean a lot to me. So thank you for being here. And some of you are up very late in Europe. And so thank you for doing that for me. A couple of words before we begin is that Jessica's put in the chat the two links which you should pay attention to. One is the handout. Everything that there's going to be slides with text. Everything that is in the slides is going to be also in the handout. But I will have to move quite swiftly through what is on the slides. So if you want to linger in a particular passage or look at the Latin, which I invite you to, or look more closely at various fragmentary editions, please look at the handout. And then there's also a transcript. So for accessibility reasons, this is a best practice that was made known to me by Chella Ward to give the full transcript of the talk as it's happening. So please do take a look at that. Maybe pull it up on your phone or a device if you want to read along with me as I speak. And also live tweeting is fine. Screenshots are fine. Just make sure I look cute in them if you post them on Twitter. Okay, that's it. All right, so let me take it away. Here's a cover of the book, which is coming out tomorrow. I do not know when I will hold it in my hands as there are global supply issues, but this is what it looks like. So that's something to look forward to. All right, so let me begin. Okay, so Cicero's De Senectute on old age begins with a quotation of Latin poetry. O Titus, if I could help or lighten the care fixed in your chest, which now boils and twists you, what will be my reward? This, incidentally, is the passage represented on the cover of the book, a 15th century Italian manuscript of Cicero's De Senectute, now in the British Library, which includes the nice detail of a marginal note on the right-hand side indicating the author of these verses, the 2nd century BCE Latin poet Quintus Ennius. Cicero's quotation of Quintus Ennius's historical epic, the Annales, at the beginning of the De Senectute immediately sets up a number of parallels. The first words, O Tite, O Titus, refer simultaneously to the dedicatee of the work, Cicero's friend Atticus, whose full name was, of course, Titus Pomponius, and to Titus Quinctius Flamininus, consul in 198 BCE. Ennius's words are thought to refer to a failed attempt at diplomacy between Flamininus and Philip of Macedon, which had taken place in a narrow gorge. Fighting ensued, but the steep terrain made it difficult for Roman soldiers to follow the king's army as it withdrew into the rugged landscape. A shepherd who pastured his sheep in the woods and who was familiar with the narrow winding paths of the mountains was sent to help Flamininus's troops to reach the king's camp. The Roman general, suspecting betrayal, did not immediately trust the shepherd, but this man promised to relieve Flamininus of his anxiety and be his guide for a price. The parallelism set up by the citation of Ennius's Annales casts Atticus in the role of Flamininus with Cicero as a shepherd guide, but just as Cicero sets up the parallel, he shatters it. Cicero continues, although certainly I know that it is not like Flamininus that you are tortured in this way, day and Titus, night and day, I know the moderation of your mind and your evenness, and I understand that you brought back not just your name from Athens, but also your humanity, your practical judgment. Flamininus and, let me remove myself slightly, Flamininus and Atticus may share the same name, but they do not share the same capacity for withstanding anxiety. Ennius's verses depict Flamininus cooked alive by apprehension, relatable, while Atticus, famously Epicurean, has learned to be even-keeled. Having connected Atticus and Flamininus via their praenomen, Titus, Cicero uses his friend's adopted name as index of their difference. It is not just the name Atticus that Titus Pomponius brought back from Athens, but the humanity and practical judgment which protect Cicero's Titus from anxiety. Cicero's treatise will offer advice, but Cicero makes clear that he knows Atticus is not in need of it. At the same time, Cicero himself takes on the role of the shepherd, the guide who will lead you through the forest of philosophy. I here begin with the beginning of Cicero's De Senectute because it is, and its invocation of Ennius's Annales, because this is an exemplary instance of Cicero's poetic citational technique. We note, first of all, that Cicero is perfectly comfortable beginning one of his own works with someone else's words and with verse. Indeed, in a letter to Atticus, Cicero refers to the De Senectute not by this title, but by these first Ennian words, i.e. O Tite si quid. This is in fact not the only time a Ciceronian treatise begins with a poetic quotation. In fact, it's reasonably common. The following Ciceronian works start with a quotation of Latin poetry: De Republica, books 1 and 5, De Finibus, De Natura Deorum, De Legibus, and several letters to begin with quotations of Latin or Greek verse. More importantly, though, Cicero's initiation of De Senectute with a quotation of poetry allows him to model the conventional relationship between the writer and his literary dedicatee. Put another way, Cicero structurally models his relationship with Atticus as the focus of dedication and reader surrogate by refracting their literary and philosophical interchange through the power dynamics dramatized by the Ennian historical vignette. Furthermore, the invocation of Ennius situates Cicero's own work within the Roman literary tradition, just as Ennius left behind a record of moral instruction via his depiction of Roman history in verse. Cicero may do the same via his philosophical revival of Cato the Elder, the primary speaker of De Senectute. Cicero's works are full of poetic quotations like this one. There are 700 or so citations of Latin poetry in the Ciceronian corpus, and I've documented perceptible quotations of Latin and Greek poetry in the Ciceronian corpus in the appendices to the book. Cicero primarily quotes Latin poetry from the previous century, the 2nd century BCE, with a marked emphasis upon the works of poets such as Ennius, Pacuvius, Accius, and Terence. Indeed, Cicero's systematic and consistent engagement with poetry across his own several prose genres, letters, speeches, and especially rhetorical and philosophical treatises, testifies to the deep significance of Latin poetry as ethical, aesthetic, linguistic, and historical resource. Cicero's quotation of poetry is not an eccentric quirk either. That is, Cicero was not the only Roman during the late Republican period to look to the poetic past in this way. The appearance of Latin verse in rhetorical treatises such as the Rhetorica ad Herennium or Cicero's own youthful De Inventione clearly demonstrate how poetry was used in the training of orators. Varro's De Lingua Latina, itself replete with quotations of Latin verse used to make linguistic definitions of Latin words, demonstrates a self-reflexive philological tradition at Rome, whereby Latin poetry became a powerful authorization of the Latin language. And finally, Cicero's own letters contain evidence of his correspondence, engaging in a similar citational practice to his own as part of a performative and playful elite discourse. Cicero and others looked to the poetic past as a resource for communicative discourses and multimodal intellectual work. And notably, this citational process is inherently transformative, not receptively inert. While assuredly venerative, it is not passive. While certainly figured as inheritance, legacy is not merely received, but put to use. While inherently conservative as a mechanism, both in the sense of conserving values as well as conserving fragments, conservation as preservation, it is also creative. Cicero's engagement with this valued poetic past is one of the principal reasons why we have some of the largest and most significant fragments of Latin poetry from the 2nd century BCE. The works of these poets whom Cicero cited, for the most part, do not have an independent manuscript tradition, with the exception of Terence. Instead, they are carried to modernity via Ciceronian textual embrace and via a filtering process of Ciceronian selection. While traditionally the editorial attitude towards Cicero's engagement with these poets has been to remove the Ciceronian element, viewed historically as an accretion without inherent worth, and indeed as a form of unforgivable distortion or corruption, the sinewy entanglement between Cicero and the poets is itself a framework of interpretation, presenting an opportunity to study late Republican intellectual processes and to investigate how Romans theorized poetry via the patterns of its use. I have found it useful to conceptualize these fragments of Latin poetry as artifacts. As we imagine it, the artifact is a historical object, something that might be taken as an example or as a physical manifestation of the culture which produced it, something in which values cohere, something inscribed with culture, a substance in which residues of a now inaccessible yet cherished world reside, an object that symbolically reflects a reality which can, to some degree, be studied and parsed out if you have the right tools. This is, I argue, the way that fragments of Latin poetry lodged within the Ciceronian textual corpus behave as powerful objects and testifying witnesses, valued artifacts of a venerated past. While this artifacting of reality or realities is a broad phenomenon undergirding the operations of Latin poetry in the Ciceronian corpus, the phenomenon of poetry as artifact presents itself in a number of different ways, as we shall shortly see. Let us now look at a passage where the representative powers of poetry are explicitly theorized. In Cicero's youthful De Inventione, we find a description of different kinds of narratio, different ways to tell a story. Now, it was the job of the orator as a lawyer to collect disparate parts of a case and put them together plausibly, convincingly. The orator had to understand, intuit, what stories his audience would accept as real or true, or at least closest to reality or truth. So here we find a breakdown of different modes of storytelling into 3 categories, with each category defined by the degree to which it relates to reality: fabula, historia, and argumentum. Fabula, Cicero says, is the name for a narrative that is not true and is not like truth, such as is found in tragedy. He quotes from Pacuvius's tragedy Medus, which seems to describe a snake chariot such as the one driven by Euripides' Medea. Next, historia, which describes, or in fact is, a real event that actually took place, but a long time ago. Historia is significantly exemplified by Ennius's Annales, not a historical account written in prose. The verse here quoted from Ennius's Annales describes a quote-unquote real event, Appius Claudius Codex, consul in 264, formally beginning the First Punic War. Lastly, argumentum, a kind of narrative that is fictitious, but nonetheless could have happened, a narrative which is potentially real and is absolutely possible, but is only unreal because it does not describe something that actually took place. This kind of storytelling is represented by Roman comedy. Cicero quotes a verse from Terence's Andria to exemplify the kind of narrative which is closest to reality. Cicero's use of poetry to define different categories of storytelling is not a unique theorization, but is absolutely conventional. We know this because there is a near identical passage in the Rhetorica ad Herennium, and the fact that these ideas appear identically in 2 rhetorical handbooks demonstrates that the mapping of narrative onto poetic genre was part of the contemporary rhetorical training system, as well as the fact that since verse was studied by the orator as part of his early rhetorical development, Latin poetry was in the DNA of Roman oratory. Indeed, that's something that is very well attested. In the De Oratore, Cicero describes a training game in which the orator memorizes a speech of Gaius Gracchus or a poem of Ennius and tries to give an oration on the same topic without reusing any of the same words. The training game anecdote demonstrates an alignment between the classics of oratory and verse, and suggests that when it came to developing style and persuasiveness through imitation, the genre of the emulated text was not limited to oratory or even to prose. Quintilian writes that young students of oratory should not learn their own compositions by heart for performance, but should instead spend their time memorizing parts of famous orations, histories, or passages from other kinds of books, which includes the reading of poets. Having memorized such exemplars, these students will be able to correct their own compositions because they will always have good models to imitate within themselves, creating a kind of internalization to the point that they will unconsciously reproduce the style of the passages which they have studied. Cicero's deep immersion into poetry as part of his rhetorical training gave him an appreciation for the different ways in which verse reflected aspects of real life and Roman culture. And he drew on this training in his own speeches. For instance, in the Pro Roscio Amarino, an early speech in which Cicero defended Sextus Roscius against the charge of parricide, Cicero alludes to a comedy by Caecilius Statius, the Hypobolymaius, in order to evoke the structural similarities between real-life father-son relationships and those depicted on the Roman comic stage, in a manner which foreshadows his more famous allusion to Roman comedy in the Procailio. Cicero uses the structures of social relationships represented in the comic stage as a model for reality. This court case centers on the deceased Sextus Roscius, who had two sons, one now dead, had lived with his father in Rome, the other, now on trial, had been banished to the country. The prosecutor made the claim that the elder Roscius hated his son, that this hatred led to the son's relegation, and that both of these things gave the son a motive for murder. The prosecution had therefore characterized the events as a family drama, the kind familiar to a Roman audience from the comic stage. Father-son conflict was, of course, a major theme of Roman comedy, as was the comic difference between the city and the country. Anne Vasily has suggested that the prosecution cast the younger Roscius as a Demia type from Terence's Adelphoi, the hard-bitten old farmer versus his easygoing and urbane brother. Cicero's allusion to Caecilius's play therefore seems intended as a rival picture of comic rusticity designed to combat the prosecution's invocation of the Roman stage. While, as Sander Goldberg has noted, Cicero in this passage is performatively imprecise, he pretends not to know for sure who the main characters are. The comic allusion is key to Cicero's defense, as it posited a general understanding of Roman life from the inference of its true depiction on the Roman comic stage. Cicero's use of generic comic types to script the normative behavior of Roman fathers and sons is in itself greatly significant, but Cicero goes on to extend the theatrical allusion into a meditation upon how comedy reflected Roman life and morals, defending his use of comic types in anticipation of the objection that comedy is fiction. Cicero claims that there is essentially no difference between the stock figure of the young man in Caecilius Statius' comedy and some real young men from Veii, an Etruscan town 12 miles north of Rome. Although comedy is not reality, it does mirror aspects of reality. Cicero says, quote, "Indeed, I think that these things were made up by the poets so that we could see our own values portrayed in other characters and a representative image of everyday life," unquote. In our opening example from the De Senectute, we saw the parallelism of poetic citation that made equivalences between Titus Quinctius Flamininus and Titus Pomponius Atticus. While such parallelism is generally operative among the poetic citations, Cicero's engagement with verse from the Roman stage is a particularly pointed example of the mirroring between the real world and the poetic world. Donatus writes that Cicero in the Hortensius called comedy an emulation of life, the mirror of experience, the image of truth. In the De Senectute, Cicero remarks that the faults of old age can be improved in real life, just as on stage, in reference to moral lessons taught by Terence's Adelphoi. Likewise, in the Tusculans, a verse from a comedy by Afranius is drawn straight from real life. In sum, Cicero's attitude towards the poetry of the Roman comic stage is that despite comedy's self-conscious performative artificiality, it nonetheless captured a truth about life at Rome as if it were a mirror of reality. Cicero's vision of Roman poetry then envisioned it as a kind of substance. In certain cases, that substance was reflective as the surface of a mirror. In other cases, it was retentive, porous, and absorptive, capable of carrying with it evidence of the past. In the De Oratore, we find a scene in which Cicero, adopting the voice of Lucius Licinius Crassus, about whom we'll have more to say shortly, reflecting on linguistic purity. Cicero here has Crassus romanticize his in-laws. Crassus's mother-in-law was Laelia, daughter of Gaius Laelius, as well as wife to Quintus Mucius Scaevola. And Laelia, Cicero imagines, had an immaculate purity of speech, the kind of purity that women from the oldest, most austere households could preserve. Indeed, Cicero notes that elite women have a particularly conservative, preservative power. Since they do not speak with the many, the multi, they are kept away from corrupting elements and retain ancestral, traditional, and atavistic qualities. As so often in Roman literature and culture, women are made into the symbol of the Roman state, in this case, serving as a record of a time which was steadily receding from view by the time Cicero wrote the De Oratore. When Crassus hears Laelia, he hears the language of her father, Gaius Laelius, and the language of her ancestors. In addition to the fact that women are here imagined as a reflective and absorptive of linguistic features, they are figured, according to my definition, as the artifact themselves. What is deeply significant is that the language of Laelia's ancestors is the language of the Latin comic poets Naevius and Plautus. In the De Inventione, Roman comedy had been coded as the poetic genre closest to reality. In the Pro Roscio Amarino, Cicero took seriously the faithfulness of the generic comic script to the realities of socio-cultural mores, to the extent that he could model and exert the form of normative father-son relationships on the comic father-son paradigm. Here, comedy is presented both as an index of historicity. Naevius's and Plautus's comedies are not just popular entertainments or even reflections of Roman cultural history, but they are imagined by Cicero as a historical artifact of their era. Essentially, Cicero argues if you wish to know how the best Romans spoke during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, you can turn to comedy to find evidence of it. And not only that, if you are privileged enough to have access to the inner sanctum of Rome's most austere households, as Cicero imagined that Crassus, via his marriage to Mucia, did, then you can encounter living Romans whose conservative cultural practices retain a historical, quote unquote, purity of language. I find this passage so remarkable because what we're essentially dealing with here is a projection of Cicero's own desires to have this kind of intimacy with the Roman past. Cicero, famously a new man who elevated himself through careful self-textualization, here demonstrates his hunger for knowledge and intimacy with Roman history as manifested through the processes of cultural replication which took place within the most elite Roman houses. Cicero's insistence on the purity of the language of Plautus and Naevius speaks to broader contemporary intellectual attitudes towards comedy, namely that old comic poets were authoritative linguistic standards. We consistently see evidence of late Republicans using comedy specifically to establish or fine-tune definitions of the Latin language. This, for instance, is clearly visible in Varro's De Lingua Latina, where Plautus is a prominent authority. Cicero, too, engaged in this kind of language work with Roman comedy. We get a playful and interesting example in a letter to Atticus. Here, Cicero responds to Atticus's insistence that Cicero had made a grammatical mistake. While in Latin, directions towards the names of towns and small islands was usually expressed in the accusative case without a preposition, Cicero had used the phrase in Piraeia towards the Piraeus, eliciting Atticus's correction. Cicero responds by saying that if he had made a mistake at all, his mistake was that he used the Greek form and not the Latin when he himself was a Roman man. But Cicero goes on to defend himself by questioning whether the Piraeus, Athens harbor, really is a town and not a place, which grammatically makes a difference. And then Cicero says, even if I did refer to Piraeus as a town, I have precedence for the use of a preposition with a town name. Caecilius Statius, in a now unknown comedy, had used the phrase in Piraeum, as did Terence in the Eunuchus. In that play, Terence also used a different prepositional phrase, a sunio, from sunium. By the way, it might be worth lingering here to note Cicero's detached attitude to the verses which he quotes, in contrast to Amy Richland's work, which sensitively searches for the real-life experiences of mass enslavement and sex trafficking embedded in the construction of Roman comedy. Cicero here has no feeling whatsoever about the woman captured at Sunium, i.e. Pamphila, but rather focuses on the language on a very literal level. Once more, Cicero quotes Roman comedy, this time as an authoritative standard for Latin usage. We do note, though, that not all authors are equally authoritative, despite the fact that he vindicated Cicero's own prepositional use. Cicero says that Caecilius Statius is a bad example of Latinity. Indeed, he is a bad auctor, a bad witness, or a bad authority. Terence, however, who is incidentally one of the poets most cited by Cicero after Ennius, is a good authority, and once more we find Cicero making equivalence between historical elite Roman identity and a Latin poet. In our previous example, the Laelius family preserved old Latinity of the ancient standards typified by Naevius and Plautus. Here, Terence's language is elegant enough to have been written by Gaius Laelius himself. Terence, therefore, is another example of historicized authority, an artifact of aristocratic linguistic capability, which can be used to make or defend contemporary claims on the Latin language. This kind of insistence upon purity and authority was a way to establish the boundaries of aristocratic and indeed nationalistic identity. Claiming the purity of a poetic precursor and insisting upon the confluence of Latinity and Roman identity led Cicero to make some xenophobic remarks. In a letter, Cicero praised his correspondent's old Roman wit as reminiscent of the satirist Lucilius, contrasting this cultural legacy with the language of trousered Gauls. Indeed, the repetitive and careful return of old poetic standards as part of the performance of aristocratic values testifies to a neurotic insistence on policing the boundaries of Romanitas with linguistic performance as a marker of in-groups and out-groups. Fascinatingly then, Roman comedy, a genre of poetry notable for its low-status literary and theatrical personnel and its mass appeal, as well as its dramatization of the absurd and the obscene, was carefully claimed by the ruling elite as part of its arsenal of self-definition. It is worth noting that when Cicero romantically visualized Naevius, Plautus, and Terence as the language of forefathers, he nonetheless sanitized their own poetic and social identities, overwriting their variegated ethnic backgrounds and social status by absorbing their literary and textual output into the superstructure of Roman elite identity. We have seen so far that while Latin poetry afforded Cicero models for social behavior and exerted linguistic authority, it also presented resources for imaginative historical reconstruction. The idea that poetry might contain historical information is suggested by the De Inventione, where historical narrative is exemplified by Ennius's Annales. But in addition to the fact that a text such as Ennius's epic history of Rome might be a legitimate source for historical information, and we'll return to this idea shortly, poetry produced during a historical period might itself contain incidental historical data which could be discovered, mined out, and put to use. One example of this use of poetry as part of historical inquiry comes from a series of letters from the summer of 45 BCE. At that time, Cicero embarked upon a composition he described as a political conference set at Olympia in the year 146 BCE. And by the way, there's no evidence that Cicero ever completed this project. As Cicero engages in historical research for the work, he writes a series of letters to Atticus asking for help in figuring out which historical figures were present at the aftermath of the capture of Corinth in 146. We learn what Cicero's tools for historical inquiry are. He can draw on his own memory, consult Atticus, his historian friend. He can consult the work of Polybius, a Greek historical source contemporary to the event he's interested in. He can draw on someone else's memory, his senior colleague Hortensius, and he can consult the work of a Roman annalist, Lucius Libo. But poetry also afforded Cicero an opportunity to establish historical facts. Cicero writes that he was sure that a certain Spurius Mummius was present at Corinth. Cicero himself had known a descendant of this Spurius Mummius, perhaps his grandson, a man with the same name. According to this letter to Atticus, the younger Spurius once read to Cicero some epistolary poems that his relative had written at Corinth and sent back to his friends at Rome. These epistolary poems by Mummius are considered by scholars to be an immediate precursor to the poetry of Lucilius the satirist. Indeed, it has been suggested that the earliest of Lucilius's satires, written in the context of Scipio Aemilianus's campaign at Numantia in Spain, were an emulation of Mummius's Corinthian letters. Cicero took these poems to be evidence of Mummius's presence at Corinth and considered including him as a character in his historical fiction set in 146 BCE. That Mummius's letters circumscribed an elite Roman sociality was precisely what made them good historical evidence for Cicero. They placed the 2nd century BCE Spurius Mummius at a specific location and time and connected him to the other historical figures. In addition to the consultation of sources, which we might consider historical in the traditional sense, Cicero found evidence of the Roman past in poetic sources. We have here evidence of Cicero composing a character from a literary artifact that he had encountered, applying his imagination to historical evidence in order to create his own work. Indeed, Cicero tells us that in certain cases, earlier Roman literature stood as a means of recording historical events that were otherwise lost. In the Brutus, Cicero says that if Lucilius the satirist had not written about Lucius Licinius Crassus dining with a herald called Granius, no one would ever have known that this politician, Crassus, had held the tribunate in 107 BCE. In the Orator, Cicero writes that Crassus published very few of his orations because regular publication of speeches did not become common until Cicero's lifetime. The absence of a record could evidently create problems for establishing even relatively recent Roman history. Cicero's citation of Lucilius as evidence that Crassus held the tribunate appears in Cicero's Brutus as part of a resume of Crassus's career as far as Cicero could textually reconstruct it. In the Brutus, Cicero is careful to tell us that he had derived this resume from Crassus's extant writing. Cicero knew that Crassus defended the Vestal Licinia because he left behind certain parts of that oration. He knew about the Narbo colony because Crassus's oration on the law for its establishment still survived. He knew that Crassus supported the Lex Servilia in 106 because the speech had been published and Cicero could assume that his interlocutor had often read it. In short, Cicero's presentation of Crassus's oratorical and political career in the Brutus relied heavily on inferences from surviving textual evidence, among which Lucilius's satires numbered, supplying data where oratorical texts were lacking. Indeed, the date of 107 BCE for Crassus's tribunate provided by Cicero's interpretation of Lucilius's satires is still the linchpin for modern reconstructions of the dates for his earlier magistracies. Cicero had been able to use Lucilius as a historical source because Lucilius's poetry presented satirical representations, poetic avatars of the poet's contemporaries, elite men in whom Cicero had great interest. Indeed, Cicero is explicit that one of the reasons why he values the Latin poets is because they were a conduit to the great men of history. Through the poets, Cicero found a window through which he could glimpse famous and venerated Romans from generations past, in addition to the fact that Lucilius happened to preserve the detail about Crassus's career, which had not been picked up by another part of the historical record. Lucilius's poetry presented Cicero's aristocratic heroes in elite play, preserving a cultural historical artifact which was greatly influential upon Cicero's own composition of historical fiction. We have seen that Cicero carefully scrutinized poetry for its ability to tell him something about the past. A certain historical residue permeated Latin poetry, even poetry which we do not now classify as particularly historical, such as Lucilius's satires. This sense of historicism arises out of poetry's ability to capture images of venerated Roman elites to various degrees of fullness, in addition to the fact that Cicero approached Latin poetry as historical by virtue of its ability to artifact the period in which it was produced. Studying poetry as a source of data for his own works, Cicero also explicitly theorized the historicism of poetry in his treatises. We've already seen that in the De Inventione, Cicero, replicating contemporary oratorical thought, gave Ennius's Annales as the exemplary example of historical narrative. At the end of his life, Cicero returned to this question of poetic historicity. For instance, in the De Divinatione, Cicero discusses a series of famous prophecies from history, including the infamous prophecy received by Croesus of Lydia from the Delphic oracle, that he would destroy a great empire. Spoiler alert, he destroys his own. Here, Cicero asks, why should I believe that Croesus ever actually received this prophecy? Furthermore, Cicero continues, why should I believe that Herodotus as a historian is any more credible than Ennius? Didn't Ennius also make up similar prophecy regarding Rome's enemy, Pyrrhus? Cicero quotes the ambiguous prophecy received by Pyrrhus in Ennius's Annales, a verse whose ambiguity here is satisfyingly communicated via Latin's accusative and infinitive construction, and the impossibility in this case of being able to tell which accusative is the grammatical subject and which the object. Cicero then follows the verse with a series of critiques. First of all, Cicero says, the Delphic Apollo never spoke Latin. Wow, isn't that a cool sentence? Secondly, the Greeks have never heard of this prophecy, i.e. it isn't attested elsewhere in the historical record. But by the time of the war with Pyrrhus, Delphic oracle had stopped giving prophecies. Lastly, the ambiguity of the verse is so absolutely clear that not even Pyrrhus would be stupid enough to actually put any weight on it. At first glance, this passage may give the impression that Ennius's Annales historicity lacked credibility. Interestingly, Cicero's criticisms here verge into literary criticism, since his remarks about the fact that, for instance, Apollo never spoke Latin reflect the fact that the poem is itself in Latin while representing words supposedly uttered originally in Greek. Likewise, the criticism that Ennius's prophecy was a bit too much like Herodotus suggests a view that Ennius was parroting a literary commonplace rather than representing events which actually happened. Nonetheless, Cicero's critical engagement with Ennius here ultimately inscribes Ennius as a historical source. First of all, Cicero in Book 2 of De Divinatione performs the role of the cynic in response to the Stoic argument that had been given in Book 1. The criticism of the implausibility of Ennius's Annales in the De Divinatione therefore arises from the perspective of an artificially constructed cynicism, a redressive kind of cynicism intended to be taken in counterbalance to opposing arguments, which should therefore not be taken in isolation and furthermore should not be taken as a programmatic statement of Cicero's stance on Ennius's perceived historicity. Furthermore, what the passage comparing oracles in Herodotus and Ennius shows is that Ennius's Annales was considered to exist in the same category as the classic historians who wrote in prose. Similarly, during the debate in the De Legibus on the historicity of Cicero's epic poem Marius, Herodotus and Theopompus are cited as writers of histories which contain numerous fabulous tales. Although their accounts contained material which strained belief, their status as historical narrative is not automatically invalidated by that fact. As Jackie Elliott has observed, even as Cicero highlights the fictitiousness of the incidents Ennius and Herodotus relate, he builds on and thus strengthens the basic assumption that what they say represents a trustworthy account of a historical reality. In this case, Herodotus and Ennius are equally under scrutiny. To some degree, that posits an alignment of historicism between them, even if an individual events might be closely scrutinized in a cynical mood. More representative of Cicero's general attitude to the artifacting process of poetry is my final example for today, a passage of the Brutus in which Ennius's Annales is once more quoted. In the Brutus, Cicero finds the beginning of documented Roman oratory not in the ancient extant orations, but in the epic poem of Ennius's Annales. In the figure of Marcus Cornelius Ceticus, consul in 204 BCE, Cicero says the Romans could see oratory valued for the first time in their history. Ennius's Annales contained the first extant use of the word orator with the meaning which Cicero and his contemporaries understood it to have, with the fullest sense of persuasive, intellectual, and ethical capability. In the De Lingua Latina, Varro had noted that there was a time in the earlier period when the word orator had only the meaning of envoy, and in fact, Varro uses Ennius's Annales to demonstrate this prior meaning. While the envoys, Varro argues, are sent precisely because of their oratorical capabilities, they are not yet the political figures recognizable to late Republican Romans. In the Brutus, then, Cicero has pinpointed the moment in history when the modern Roman consciousness comes online and the term orator takes on a new definition. In this moment of redefinition, the Roman orator appears for the first time with specific characteristics. Not only is he sweet speaking, but crucially, he is praised for his eloquence. The Roman people call Cetagis the choice flower and the marrow of persuasion. Cicero is not interested in Cetagis because of his talent, but because his talent is recognized. Within the narrative of Ennius's poem, the poetic characters praise Cetagis. Outside of the narrative, Ennius's authorial decision to elaborate upon the moment is evidence of its historical and cultural significance. Cicero also explicitly reflects upon the power and veracity of Ennius's account as historical testimony. Ennius's account of Cetagis' eloquence is, Cicero argues, especially trustworthy because the poet actually heard him, i.e., Ennius was an eyewitness, or in Jackie Elliott's words, Ennius's testimony is out-optic rather than out-otic. Since Ennius, or rather out-otic. Since Ennius wrote after the consul's death, there was also no suspicion that he distorted the record because of their friendship. Unlike Roman prose historiography, with its tendency, according to Cicero, to bloat the praise of famous Romans due to its reliance upon funerary orations, Ennius could present a vision of history untainted by political preference, or at least untainted by the political perspective with which Cicero himself disagreed. It is significant, too, that Cicero calls Ennius the author of Cetagis' eloquence. Ennius is not only an author in the sense of the writer of these verses, but also the authorizer of Cetagis' eloquence. Finally, just as Cicero had relied upon Lucilius to preserve the record of Crassus's oratorical career, Cicero emphasizes Ennius's role in the conservation of Roman history. Quote, "If the knowledge of his eloquence were not known to us by the sole testimony of Ennius, time would have consigned him to oblivion, as it has doubtless many others," unquote. Without Ennius's account, Cicero says, Vetustas time would have destroyed the memory of Roman eloquence, consigning it to oblivion. Like Lucilius, Ennius had the power to preserve moments of deep significance and to testify to their significance in the act of preservation. Let me now start to bring us to a closure point with some concluding remarks. Over the course of this talk, I have attempted to trace Cicero's artifactual attitude towards Latin poetry. In a number of different ways, Cicero figures poetry as a substance, whether reflective as a mirror, or else retentive and absorptive. We have seen that poetry was theorized to have a relationship to reality inflected by genre, and that some genres of poetry, for instance, comedy and epic, were believed to be faithful to the experiences of reality and reflective of history. At the same time, poetry from a venerated past was itself an artifact of that past. To hear the voice of Rome's ancestors, one could fruitfully turn to Naevius or Plautus, and in turn, that authoritative ancient voice was invoked in the late Republican period for the regulation of aristocratic codes rooted in a conservative concept of linguistic purity. Latin poetry was also able to pick up and preserve parts of the past which had been overlooked by the historical record. The political career of a great man could be found as testimony in a satirical vignette which Cicero mined for historical data. And while poetry's historicity might be questioned, the historical scrutiny which it received was parallel with the scrutiny of other legitimate historical sources. In the end, the artifactual power of Latin poetry gave Cicero and other late Republicans the opportunity to examine their own past and to seek continuity with the cultural legacy. Thank you.